So open up your minds and be ready to take it in.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Tony suggested I talk to the group about planning a profitable sheep enterprise, and so the inference was that there might be people in the room who are being swayed to put more sheep in their business over time and less cropping. So I'll try and provide some useful content with regards to that sort of decision making in the course of this presentation. I'll just start with comparing profitability between flocks from our benchmarking. We benchmark roughly 150 farms every year. We have done for 15, 20 years. And in terms of sheep, it's a bit over 1 million sheep. And so we get, over time, we've got a pretty good handle on the variation in profits between farms. But this data here is just the 2014 year. However, it is actually quite representative of longer term data. Okay, so what we see through the benchmarking is that on average, last year, 2014, people produced roughly $20 of profit per hectare per 100 mils of rain that they received. That was the average. So if you received 500 mils of rain, it was $100 a hectare profit. If you received 1,000, it's $200 a hectare profit. Now these returns are actually at the moment very competitive with other businesses, whether it be beef, well, beef's been the laggard lately, but beef or cropping. And we could proudly say that sheep, and it doesn't matter what persuasion, sheep can hold their own against all other enterprises in the current market circumstance. However, if you were amongst the most profitable flocks, sheep flocks, your profits were double the average. And so you're producing $40 per hectare per 100 mils of profit. And that's a consistent message across years, across regions. It doesn't change from year to year. Who those people are does change slightly from year to year, but we do know that more profitable flocks produce twice the average, and we also know that a benchmarking average is a skewed sample of the industry, and that's probably twice the average of the industry generally. So because we've got a skewed sample, not because it's anything to do with Homles Sackett, but by the nature of people who participate in that they're interested, we have a skewed sample in the data. So the opportunity is take the business from 20 to 40, or if you're already at 40, can you get to 45? Because that's the average of the top 20%. So a fifth of the database is in that data, and there's actually quite a significant range within that. So it seems to me there's always opportunity, and we're always looking for room for improvement. And if you're a sad economic rationalist like me, you just want to make a bit more money out of the job. I often get asked, well, who are these people and what do they look like? And how do we know what to do? What sort of KPIs do they have, and where do they come from, this top 20%? And so what I did is I've pulled out some key data, some key stats from that group. And again, this is from the 2014 data, but again, it is representative of the historical years. So, where do they come from? Well, the graph down the bottom shows where all our benchmarking clients come from, so mostly southern and eastern Australia. We get the odd Queenslander, and we've had the odd Western Australian person, but predominantly New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, a little bit in South Australia, southeast South Australia. Regions, well, from pastoral regions with 370 mils in the 2014, or 350 mils of rain in 2014, up to high rainfall properties with well over 1,000 millimetres of rain. In that top 20%, this is just the top 20%, by the way, that data up there. So this isn't the average, this isn't the range of all people in the database. In 2014, the top 20% most profitable, this is where they came from. So we had people in high rainfall regions, we had people in pastoral regions. In terms of their reproductive rates, and I've split between wool flocks and lamb flocks. In wool flocks we had people whose lambs weaned per ewe joined. So this is inclusive of all ewes where the ram went out, how many lambs weaned. So we had, the range was 53% to 109% in merinos. So that wool flocks only includes merino sheep. In lamb flocks it was from 71% to 128% in that top 20%. Now there were people in the database as a whole with 150%, and there were people with lower than 71% in the database as a whole. But within that top 20%, that was the range. So the range is substantial. Stocking rates, 0.4 DSE per hectare per 100 mils to 3 DSE per hectare per 100 mil. Again, substantial variation. In terms of fibre diameter, in the wool flocks from 17 micron flocks, that's the adult average, 17 micron to 21 micron. And in the prime lamb, 18 to 34. Well, that's because in some of those prime lamb flocks, what we call prime lamb flocks or lamb flocks, we've got merino ewes joined to terminal sires. So they're not self-replacing. So that's why that range is wider in that group. And just lamb production specifically, from store lambs, you know, selling store lambs at 9 kilos dressed weight through to heavyweight lambs at 24 kilos dressed weight was the range. So what does that tell us about being the most profitable sheep flock? You know, on the surface it looks like it doesn't matter what you do. There's something else involved. And to be honest, that's a little bit true. If I had to pick just one thing, and I was only allowed to talk about just one thing, which I won't, but if that was the case, I would say it's really attitude is the primary thing. And the really one common attribute of these people who tend to stay in the top 20% over the long term is that they are profit focused. Okay, and their decision making revolves primarily around profits. And now, if I ask the group, I'm sure everyone will say I'm profit focused. But there's a litmus test, and the litmus test is what would you change, or what wouldn't you change, and still be profit focused. And so if you've got, you know, sacred cows or sacred sheep in your flock that you won't change because you've always done it and this is what you enjoy, then that's immediately a sign that your level of being profit focused is dropped down a little bit. Okay? So the more of those you have, the more things you won't change, the less profit focused I would say you are. Because the profit focused people are prepared to look at anything to keep them more profitable, and they're prepared to let go of those sacred sheep, you know, the things that they've always done in the past. If we get away from attributes and we get to core sort of business things, what's common amongst these people, I would say first and foremost it's this concept of optimum pasture utilisation. And you know, we've talked a lot about in the past about maximum maximum of everything. I want maximum sheep to the hectare, I want maximum weights at sale, I want maximum, you know, but realistically we do observe and we do see that we're talking about optimums, not maximums. And pasture utilisation is the core of the business in the sheep flock. And so I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, but it's the common thread. The second common thread is that the sheep are fit to produce. You know, so dead sheep don't make money. Diseased sheep aren't as profitable. You know, the sheep have to be fit to produce, and so you have to have a good handle on that, and you have to know what fit to produce is. It doesn't mean they're so fit that they're going to be immune to any disease, but they've got to be fit enough to survive in the system. And lastly, and just as importantly, the business has got to have good cost control. And I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. So they're the three things that I think are common amongst all these producers. What we see is that the production system you choose has a significant bearing on the opportunity you have in front of you. Okay, so what I'm saying by that is, if you look at the theory of cost of production and production, in theory, what we see is as production increases, cost of production falls to start with, and that's because everyone's got a few fixed costs. The rates you pay on your land are fixed, so it doesn't matter how much you produce each year, you've still got to pay those rates. Okay, and what we're seeing as you're increasing production, cost of production is falling, is you're dispersing some of those fixed costs. However, realistically, if we're honest about it, agriculture doesn't have a lot of fixed costs. Most of our costs are variable. As you go up the production path, trying to get more and more production, costs start to increase, because the next kilo of live weight or the next kilo of clean wool costs more than the last kilo, because it might need more supplementary feed, or it might require more labour input into the business. Okay, and so what we see is that some systems, those costs escalate at lower levels of production quite quickly, and in other systems they can go to high levels of production with quite a low cost structure. Okay, and then on top of that, the third key thing is price. And so what you want in the ideal world is a lot of production, a very low cost of production, and the premium price. It's as simple as that. Most of what you can control is on this page, it's production and cost of production, and most of the variation in profits we see are driven by those two things, cost of production and production. Understanding your system and knowing whether the production system you're employing, which includes the markets you're trying to get to, is the red dotted line or the green dotted line, is very important. And that's where benchmarking plays a massive role, and particularly benchmarking groups, in our experience, is because you get to see everyone's got a slightly different production system, and everyone's got a different idea of how they should do it and what will work and what won't work. But what we tend to work out with the benchmarking and benchmarking groups over time is that bloke's system works year in, year out. And when we get the set of circumstances that blows the red line out in terms of cost of production, that green line has still stayed low. So we're after these production systems that really allow you to keep your cost structures low and your production high. That tends to revolve around lambing dates and stocking rates, okay, as much as anything. So when you lambing being a high demand period for the sheep in terms of pasture demand, when you lamb being a key decision in having a good profitable sheep flock. And to be honest, if I had to pick a date, I'd say it's a month later than you already are. Okay, that's my experience. That most people tend to go a little bit early because a little bit early is a little bit easy. Okay, it tends to be easier to go early. The management doesn't have to be as spot on as lambing late. There's nothing worse than merino weaners, smaller merino weaners over summer and autumn, is there? There's nothing worse than your lambs just not quite getting to market weights, and then there's a big high cost of trying to get them that last few kilos. They're the most expensive kilos in the prime lamb, isn't it? So it tends to be that you go a little bit early to give yourself a little bit more room to get those, so you've got a bit more room for error to get to those markets. However, if you could control those things through all the other facets of your business, the genetics and the nutrition and all that stuff, then a little bit later is probably going to be more profitable in our experience. So lambing date is a key decision in planning a profitable flock. Lambing dates allow stock numbers, sheep numbers. The number of sheep you carry in a year will be largely determined by lambing date. And we know, and stocking rate's still important, we know it's still important. It shows up a very high correlation to profits every year. We know that you need as many stock as you can possibly carry sensibly, and that's going to drive your pasture utilisation. So what you need to know when planning a profitable flock is really whose system is on the red line and whose system's on the green line. And if you can, adopt this green line, because they're the ones that tend to keep you in the top 20% on long-term data. So what matters? Lambing date, stocking rate, and animal health. And as we shift our lambing dates later, as we increase our sheep numbers, guess what becomes the biggest problem? Animal health. We put more pressure on the system, we put more pressure on the sheep, and the strategic animal health programs become far more important. And they become important because they avoid the production losses, and they minimise, the cost, overall cost of keeping the sheep healthy. Costs have got to be controlled. Labour's a big one, and important. No more important than the others, but it's important. So labour efficiency, how much you spend on parasites, consultants, accountants, all that sort of thing. They're your parasites. You've got to keep that under control. How much you spend on personal versus business use. It's very easy to hide personal use in a business. It's not necessarily very profitable to do so. So costs are very important, and you've got to have good attention to where the money's being spent. The more profitable producers don't necessarily spend less or more than average levels of profitability. But where they spend their money is usually significantly different. Okay, so they usually spend it on things that are going to make them money. Growing more pasture, the animal health, the key things. They tend to be miserable on things that they consider as just a cost in your business. So infrastructure needs to be adequate, but it doesn't need to be shiny. Plant and equipment needs to be adequate, but it doesn't need to be shiny. Those sort of things is where they'll look to cut the costs. The rest, the things we talk about the most, they're important, but you can have the best genetics in the world, you can have the best pastures in the world, you can have the highest reproduction rates in the district, and you can still not be the most profitable farm in the district. So I'm not saying they're not important, I'm saying there's some structural issues above that you have to get right before you even worry about those things. Because you can have average pastures, you can have average genetics, and you can have, as we've seen in that previous data, very below average reproduction rates and still be in that top 20%. But it doesn't work the other way around. Okay, so when you're thinking about your flock, it is very important to get this stuff right first. What is my target market and why? I'm going to the market where I can get as much production as with a low cost as possible. That's the one I'd choose. If I'm going to go to that market, what's my lambing date going to be and why? And how? And is it appropriate? Is it putting a little bit of stress on me? If it's not, it's probably not appropriate. How many sheep am I going to run through to that market? And that should change with seasons every year. So, this year we should be starting to think about, well, if this El Nino forecast does come to fruition and we do get a drought, how am I going to get my sheep numbers down to an appropriate level and when? What am I lining up to go and when am I going to make those decisions? You need to have your animal health program, a strategic animal health program in place, and then you get the fun bit, start working on the costs, squeezing the margins on everyone else's business that's selling you stuff. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sandy. You really did stick